At its peak, WeWork was worth $47 billion. It was hailed as the future of work, a revolutionary company that claimed it would reshape how the world lives, works, and connects. Then, almost overnight, everything collapsed. In less than a year, that $47 billion dream was reduced to financial wreckage. Investors panicked. Employees watched their stock options turn to dust. And one of the most hyped startups in modern history became a global humiliation. This was not a slow decline. There was no long warning period, no gradual loss of relevance. This was a sudden implosion, triggered by arrogance, fueled by cheap money, and exposed the moment the lights came on. Behind the glossy offices, the inspirational slogans, and the cult-like charisma, WeWork was hiding a fatal flaw. A flaw so fundamental that once the illusion cracked, the entire empire shattered. What followed was one of the most brutal collapses Silicon Valley has ever witnessed. And it all started with a lie that everyone wanted to believe. Before the collapse, WeWork was not just a company, it was a movement. Founded in 2010. WeWork entered the market at the perfect moment when startups were exploding, freelancers were everywhere, and the traditional office suddenly felt outdated. While old landlords sold square meters and long-term leases, WeWork sold something far more seductive: belonging. Walk into a WeWork location in its early years, and it didn't feel like an office. It felt like the future. Glass walls, exposed concrete, free-flowing coffee, founders brainstorming at communal tables, startups pitching ideas in hallways, carefully engineered sense that something important was always happening just one desk away. At the center of it all stood Adam Neumann, charismatic, visionary, and endlessly confident. He didn't describe WeWork as a real estate company. He described it as a tech-powered platform for human connection, and people believed him. Investors didn't just buy into the business, they bought into the story. By the mid-2010s, WeWork was expanding at a breathtaking pace. Cities, countries, continents. Each new location reinforced the illusion of inevitability. Growth became the proof. Scale became the strategy. Then came the ultimate validation: SoftBank. With billions of dollars pouring in, WeWork's valuation skyrocketed. Every funding round pushed it higher: 10 billion, 20 billion, then far beyond what traditional logic could justify. To the outside world, WeWork looked unstoppable. To insiders, it felt like riding a rocket ship with no brakes. But what no one wanted to ask, not founders, not investors, not the media, was a simple question. What was actually holding this empire up? And what would happen if the growth ever stopped? This is where everything went wrong. Not with a scandal, not with a market crash, but with a single, fatal assumption hidden at the core of WeWork's business model. WeWork believed it had escaped the rules of real estate. On paper, the company looked like a technology platform: flexible memberships, short-term commitments, a frictionless experience for modern workers. But behind the glass walls and minimalist design, WeWork was doing something brutally old-fashioned. It was signing long-term, fixed lease obligations, often 10 to 15 years, on some of the most expensive real estate in the world. Then it turned around and sold that space back to customers on monthly, cancel-anytime contracts. That mismatch was not a detail. It was the bomb. As long as growth was accelerating, the flaw stayed hidden. New members covered old leases. New cities masked losses in older ones. Scale became the excuse for ignoring basic economics. At the center of this strategy was Adam Neumann, a leader who genuinely believed that scale itself could rewrite the rules. He argued that once WeWork became big enough, occupancy would always rise, demand would always follow, and the risk would somehow disappear. Investors reinforced that belief. Fueled by billions from SoftBank, WeWork was pushed to expand faster, sign bigger leases, and lock itself into even more long-term commitments. Profitability was dismissed as outdated thinking. Losses were reframed as investment in community. But real estate does not care about vision. When demand slows, leases do not renegotiate themselves. When members leave, rent is still due. And when growth stops, the entire structure collapses under its own weight. This wasn't a leadership style issue. It wasn't a branding problem. It was a structural flaw, one that guaranteed disaster the moment the market stopped believing the story. And that moment was coming far sooner than anyone expected. The backlash was instant, and it was brutal. The moment WeWork filed its IPO prospectus, the illusion collapsed in public view. What was supposed to be a victory lap turned into a global autopsy. Investors didn't see a revolutionary tech company. They saw staggering losses, chaotic governance, and a business model bleeding cash. Financial media went into attack mode. Headlines mocked the company's language. Analysts tore apart its numbers. Commentators questioned how a firm losing billions of dollars could ever justify its valuation. Within days, the IPO filing became one of the most dissected documents in Silicon Valley history. Social media exploded. Twitter threads went viral, line by line ridiculing the prospectus. Memes flooded the internet, comparing WeWork to a motivational cult disguised as a startup. Influential voices in tech and finance openly laughed at the idea that this was a technology company. What made it worse was the spotlight on Adam Neumann. His personal behavior, once celebrated as eccentric genius, was now framed as reckless excess. Stories about private jets, lavish spending, and conflicts of interest dominated the conversation. The narrative flipped almost overnight from visionary founder to symbol of unchecked startup arrogance. Even longtime supporters began to distance themselves. Confidence evaporated. Potential investors pulled back. The valuation that once seemed untouchable started collapsing in real time. Inside the company, panic set in. Employees watched the headlines refresh by the minute. Executives scrambled behind closed doors, and the market delivered a clear verdict. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't bad press. It was a public rejection. WeWork had gone from the future of work to a cautionary tale, and the fall had only just begun. The collapse of WeWork was not a matter of opinion. It was written in numbers, and those numbers were devastating. At its peak, WeWork commanded a valuation of $47 billion. Within months of its failed IPO attempt, that figure was slashed to less than $8 billion. In under a year, nearly $40 billion of perceived value evaporated. But valuation was only the surface. Behind the scenes, the company was hemorrhaging cash at an astonishing rate. In the year leading up to the IPO, WeWork reported billions in losses, burning through money faster than almost any major startup in history. Revenue was growing, but expenses were growing even faster, and profitability wasn't just distant, it was nowhere in sight. The most dangerous number wasn't on the income statement. It was hidden in the footnotes. WeWork was locked into tens of billions of dollars in long-term lease obligations, fixed costs stretching more than a decade into the future. These were commitments that could not shrink when demand slowed, could not adapt when markets turned, and could not be explained away with storytelling. When confidence collapsed, so did the stock price. Shares that once symbolized the future of work became nearly worthless. Employees lost the wealth they were promised. Early optimism turned into silent resignation. Layoffs followed. Locations were shut down. Expansion plans were scrapped overnight. Every new report told the same story. Revenue growth could not outrun structural losses. Scale did not create safety. It magnified risk. These numbers removed all remaining doubt. This was not a temporary setback. This was not a valuation correction. It was a mathematical inevitability finally catching up with a fantasy. To understand why WeWork collapsed so violently, you have to look beyond the headlines and focus on the system that allowed it to happen. This was not just a bad business decision. It was a perfect storm of incentives, psychology, and timing. First, the strategy itself was fundamentally misaligned with reality. WeWork tried to combine the worst risks of two industries. From real estate, it inherited massive fixed costs and long-term obligations. From tech, it adopted a growth-at-all-costs mindset. The result was a company that took on permanent risk while promising temporary flexibility. That contradiction could survive only as long as demand was rising. Second, leadership amplified the danger. Adam Neumann did not see constraints as limits. He saw them as obstacles to be overcome by belief in scale. In that worldview, profitability was optional, governance was secondary, and discipline was something to worry about later. The organization absorbed that mentality. Questioning the vision became synonymous with not understanding it. Third, investor behavior removed every remaining safeguard. With SoftBank flooding the company with capital, WeWork never faced the pressure to slow down. Losses were tolerated. Warnings were ignored. Every new round of funding reinforced the idea that growth itself was proof of correctness. In reality, it was simply postponing the moment of truth. Fourth, storytelling replaced accountability. WeWork mastered the language of purpose, community, and transformation. These narratives were powerful enough to distract from basic financial questions. When a company convinces the market it is changing the world, traditional metrics suddenly feel irrelevant. That illusion worked until public scrutiny made it impossible to maintain. Finally, timing turned a fragile structure into a disaster. The moment capital markets tightened and risk tolerance evaporated, WeWork lost the oxygen it depended on. Growth slowed. Investors demanded clarity. And without endless new money to cover old commitments, the math collapsed instantly. This is the most important lesson of the WeWork story. The company did not fail because people stopped wanting flexible offices. It failed because its business model required eternal optimism in a world that eventually demands proof. When reality arrived, it arrived all at once. And when that happened, no amount of branding, vision, or charisma could stop the collapse. When the illusion finally shattered, leadership did not survive the fallout. Inside WeWork, emergency meetings replaced visionary speeches. Boardrooms that once celebrated hypergrowth were suddenly focused on damage control. And at the center of the storm stood Adam Neumann, now seen not as an asset, but as a liability. The decision came quickly. Neumann was forced to step down as CEO, stripped of control over the company he helped build. The charismatic founder who once commanded rooms with confidence exited under pressure, leaving behind a leadership vacuum and a deeply shaken organization. What followed was brutal. Executives were replaced. Teams were dissolved. Thousands of employees were laid off as the company fought to survive. Expansion plans were canceled overnight. Ambitious projects were quietly abandoned. Entire departments disappeared as WeWork shifted from growth obsession to sheer survival. The message was clear. The era of unchecked ambition was over. Behind closed doors, investors took control. Cost-cutting became the new strategy. Discipline replaced vision. Every decision was now filtered through one question: how long could the company stay alive? No leader emerged untouched. Reputations were damaged. Careers were derailed. A once celebrated startup became a warning whispered across Silicon Valley. The collapse didn't just destroy a valuation. It dismantled a power structure built on belief rather than fundamentals. WeWork was no longer chasing the future of work. It was fighting against its own past. The collapse of WeWork offers lessons far more uncomfortable than most founders or investors want to admit. The first lesson is simple but brutal. Growth does not fix a broken model. Scaling faster does not erase structural risk. It amplifies it. WeWork didn't fail because it wasn't big enough. No, because becoming bigger only made the consequences bigger. The second lesson is about storytelling. Vision matters. Narrative matters. But when storytelling replaces discipline, reality eventually pushes back. WeWork proved that you can sell a dream to employees, investors, and the media, but you cannot sell it to the balance sheet. At some point, numbers demand answers. The third lesson is leadership accountability. Charisma is not governance. Confidence is not strategy. When leaders surround themselves with belief instead of skepticism, mistakes are no longer challenged. They are accelerated. WeWork's culture rewarded agreement, not scrutiny, and that made failure inevitable. Finally, the most dangerous lesson of all: markets can stay irrational long enough to reward the wrong behavior. For years, WeWork was celebrated precisely because it ignored traditional rules. That applause delayed the collapse, but it also guaranteed that when the fall came, it would be catastrophic. This is why the WeWork story still matters. It is not about offices. It is not about one founder. It is about what happens when ambition outruns reality, and no one dares to slow it down. The story of WeWork is not just a collapse. It is a warning. A warning about blind belief, about money that arrived too easily, about what happens when no one asks the uncomfortable questions. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think WeWork was doomed from the start? Or could this disaster have been avoided? Was this a failure of leadership or a failure of the entire startup system? If you want more deep, shocking breakdowns of business empires that rose fast and fell hard, subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments which company you want us to dissect next, because some empires don't collapse quietly. They collapse in front of the entire world.